Avi Shlaim is an Israeli-British historian born in Baghdad, Iraq. Avi Shlaim, thank you so much for your scholarly work and your literary work, and welcome to the Kalam podcast.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to take part in this conversation with you, Edgar.
The pleasure is all mine. I'd like to begin by quoting someone, your distant relative, Yitzhak Bar Moshe. I'm not sure if that's the correct pronunciation of his name. Okay, well, that's good. But you quote him in your writing as saying that a history of more than 2,000 years is liquidated in less than 2,000 hours. And I want to get back to the experience that sentiment kind of expresses and what it has meant for you personally in your life. But I'd like to first get another sort of just a current affairs question out of the way, because I'm interested in how you would answer this. In your book, Three Worlds, which I would recommend to anyone who wants to learn more about the Iraqi Jews, you write that for all their crimes, comparisons between the Israelis and the Nazis are far-fetched, since Israelis have not committed genocide. And I've seen you say something about this in the past few months, but could you, for our sake, for Kalam podcast, have you revised that opinion in the past few months, and how do you view this given what's happening in Gaza right now?
So, as you quoted from my book, although I'm highly critical of Zionism, I said that for all its sins, Israel has not been guilty of genocide. But I wrote this 2 years ago, and since the Hamas attack on Israel on the 7th of October, I had to reassess my position. And initially, I was very reluctant to use the word genocide. Genocide is a very big word. And the Holocaust was the worst crime in history. And it seemed far-fetched to accuse Israel, the country of Jews who survived the Holocaust, to accuse Israel of committing genocide. But I've been observing Israeli actions over the last 8 months, and I've come to the conclusion that Israel is guilty of genocide. The South African government charged Israel with genocide in the International Court of Justice in The Hague. And the ruling of the court was that South Africa made a plausible case that Israel is committing genocide. This is huge. The World Court saying that it's not didn't dismiss out of hand the charge of genocide. And since then, I have come to the conclusion that Israel is perpetrating genocide. And I'm writing a book currently, and the title is going to be Genocide in Gaza, Israel's Long War Against Palestinian Statehood. So yes, I have revised my opinions because Israeli behavior has changed. I've observed Israeli policy towards Gaza very closely since the first military offensive, since Operation Cast Lead in December 2008. By my count, the current offensive is the 8th Israeli military offensive on the people of Gaza. But it's gone way beyond anything that has happened before. It's gone beyond ethnic cleansing, destruction, and carnage to actually committing genocide. And so that's my current position on this issue.
Yeah, thank you for that sort of clarification. I think you put it quite eloquently, and I find myself in the same kind of. I've also revised completely, and I think it's more and more difficult to deny that what's happening is a genocide. But so returning to the kind of topic for our discussion today, you were born in Baghdad in 1945 to an upper middle class family, and you lived somewhat, in the lap of luxury for the first 5 years of your life. Could you tell us about some of your memories from this time?
We lived a life of real luxury. My father was a very rich merchant, and my parents had a very high social status. They mixed with ministers and with the elite, and we had many Muslim friends. And my mother used to always speak with great nostalgia about the wonderful Muslim friends that we had in Baghdad. And one day I asked her, did we have any Zionist friends? And she said, no, Zionism is an Ashkenazi thing. It's nothing to do with us. So we were Iraqi Jews. We were Iraqis whose religion happened to be Judaism, just as there were Muslim Iraqis and Christian Iraqis. We were Arab Jews in every sense of the word. We spoke Arabic at home, our culture was Arab culture, our social customs were Arab customs, and we lived very happily and very comfortably in Iraqi society. Moreover, my parents were patriotic Iraqis because they had deep roots in the country. The Jews had been in Iraq since the Babylonian exile 2.5 millennia ago. And the Jews in Iraq played a very active part in the process of nation building after the First World War. At every level, they were a very constructive element of Iraqi society. So for my family and me, Muslim-Jewish harmony was not anything out of the ordinary. It wasn't a distant dream. It was the everyday reality. And we experienced it. We touched it. So my main memory of living in Iraq, not just personal memories, but conversations with my parents and relatives, my main memory is that of being part of Iraqi society, being comfortable in Iraqi society, being accepted by Iraqi society, and having a very settled, comfortable, fulfilling life until the emergence of the State of Israel in 1948 and the first Arab-Israeli War, and everything changed after that.
Yeah, like you mentioned, Jews had continuously inhabited the region of Mesopotamia since the destruction of the first temple and the Babylonian exile. This is, 2,500 years ago. And in 1950, there were about 130,000, if I'm not mistaken, Jews living in Iraq. And obviously there was huge diversity. You described your family's experience, but could you try to give a more general overview of the cultural makeup of the Jewish community, maybe the political makeup as well, and what was their position as a community in greater Iraqi society?
The Jews in Iraq tended to be better educated than the rest of the population. And there was a network of Jewish schools based in Paris, the Alliance Israélite Universelle, which had Jewish schools throughout the Ottoman Empire, including in Baghdad. And my mother went to the Alliance School for Girls in Baghdad, where they taught them 4 languages: French, English, Arabic, and Hebrew. And the teaching medium was French. So my mother emerged from that school fluent in French and English, as well as Arabic. I emphasize Jewish education because it was a Western education, and the Jews had a Western culture. They were good at languages, and that's why the British, during the Mandate in Iraq, tended to give preference to Jews because they were better educated and they were good at languages. And the same went for Christians as well. Now, we were an affluent, upper middle class Jewish family. And some people have said to me that in my book, I write about the Jewish community in Iraq at that time through rose-tinted glasses. There is something in that, but it's an autobiography, so I only describe the experience of my family and myself. This is not to deny that there were poor people. The Jewish community was not monolithic in social terms. There were upper middle classes, there were a very solid, large middle class, but there was also a large number of really poor Jews. And they spread over all the professions. There were the intellectuals, there were journalists, there were writers, there were novelists, there were doctors, and lawyers, but there were also very poor Jews who did manual works, and so there was no homogeneity about the Jewish community in Iraq. But what I think was common to all Jewish classes is a sense of belonging, that this was the only homeland we had. This is the only country we knew. Arabic was our language, and there was no sense of being aliens in Iraq. Iraq had a large number of minorities, and there was the long tradition of religious tolerance between the minorities. And in Iraq, the Jews didn't live in ghettos. Iraq did not have a Jewish problem, in inverted commas. Europe had a Jewish problem. And in Iraq, we were one minority among many. And it was the establishment of the State of Israel that for the first time gave Jews a territorial dimension. There was now a Jewish state, so anyone who didn't like Jews, like the Istiklal Party, right-wing nationalist party in Iraq, would say to the Jews, you don't belong here, you are aliens, you are foreigners, you are the brothers of the Zionists in Palestine who have expelled the Palestinians from Palestine. So Zionism had a major impact on Jewish history in giving it a territorial base.
Most Iraqi Jews, like you said, were completely integrated into Iraqi society. I mean, why wouldn't they be, having lived there for millennia, and spoke Arabic? But I'm just curious about the sort of minor cultural differences. What were some of the particularities of the Jewish community? For example, I'm interested in how does an Iraqi Jewish dialect sound in Arabic, and how is that different from the sort of ordinary Iraqi Arabic dialect? Because you do relate a memory in your book of during one of the times of tension, there was a police officer who who cursed at your mother's driver or maybe your grandmother's driver because he recognized the Jewish dialect. How does this sound, and what was it, a dialectical thing or vocabulary or?
So the Jews had a distinct dialect in Arabic, and it was immediately recognizable that it was a Jewish dialect. The Muslim dialect was different, and most Jews spoke in the Jewish dialect, but when they spoke to Muslims, they could switch to the prevailing dialect of the society. So this was something that distinguished the Jews, but it wasn't a problem. There was local communications. There wasn't a cultural gap. In the 1990s, Professor Samuel Huntington of Harvard popularized the notion of a clash of civilizations. And this has sometimes been applied by right-wing Israeli historians to the Jews in the Arab countries to say there was a cultural clash of civilizations, and Muslim society rejected the Jews. That's why they all ended up in Israel. I totally reject the notion of clash of civilizations. The driver of our displacement was not cultural or religious. It was political. To give you just one example, during 1941, there was a Farhud, there was a program against the Jews. And after that, my mother, who was a schoolgirl, she was about 16, she and her friends felt vulnerable. So they would wear an abaya, so you wouldn't be able to see that they were any different to Muslim girls. And they would speak in a Muslim dialect rather than a Jewish dialect, so that they couldn't be identified as Jewish. But these were the exceptions rather than the everyday life in Iran.
Yeah, and I definitely want to get. We're going to get to those dramatic events that sort of led up to the exodus from Iraq. And we at Kalam Podcast definitely position ourselves in very much opposition to the notion of the clash of civilization. I think this is completely ridiculous, especially when it comes to the Jews of Iraq, which makes it such an interesting case to think about. But I was just wondering if, and you may not, I'm not sure if you could relate this and how difficult it would be to say it in English. But I'm just curious of like what exactly did a Jewish dialect sound like, and how was it different from a Muslim dialect?
I don't know. Jews would say, "Qalyu qaltulu." He said to me, and I said to him. And in Muslim dialect, it would be "Galliu qaltulu."
Okay. So the Jews don't say "gaff." Okay. Okay. Interesting. Yeah. So a series of events involving world wars, imperial powers, conflicting nationalisms, a series of bombs set off in Baghdad, and the infamous pogrom that you mentioned ultimately made it impossible for Jews to stay in Iraq. And in your writing, you talk about a kind of push and pull effect between Zionism and Arab nationalism. So this is a huge question, obviously, but what were the political forces that drove the Jews out of Iraq?
So the Zionist version of history says that the big event in Iraqi Jewish history is the Farhud, the pogrom in June 1941, and that this was a manifestation of perennial and endemic Arab anti-Semitism, which burst into the open with catastrophic results for the Jewish community. I challenge this version of history. I say that the Farhud was a complex phenomenon, and that there was anti-Semitism, but that wasn't the driving force. The main responsibility for the Farhud I attribute to Britain, British colonialism, the British policy of divide and rule, which turned the Jews into scapegoats of anyone who was resentful of Jews. And also, many of the Muslims in mixed neighborhoods protected their Jewish neighbors. So it wasn't so straightforward. And the Farhud shook the Jewish community to its core. But after the Farhud, the leadership did a reassessment and concluded that it was a one-off event and that life could go back to normal. So I deny that 1941 was the turning point for the Jews of Iraq. For me, the turning point was 1948, the emergence of the State of Israel, and the Iraqi army fought in the war for Palestine. After the end of the war, the Iraqi army withdrew without Iraq signing an armistice agreement with Israel. All the neighboring Arab states signed armistice agreements with Israel in 1949, but Iraq remained officially at war with Israel to this day.
Yeah. And
so the 1948 was what accounted for the backlash against the Jews, not just in Iraq, but throughout the Arab world. And I'll remind you that there were Jewish communities, thriving Jewish communities throughout the Middle East and North Africa, in Syria, in Lebanon, in Egypt. But the Jewish community in Iraq was the most ancient, the best established, the most prosperous, the most successful, and the best integrated Jewish society of all of these other communities. And the backlash was against the Jews of the Arab world, throughout the Arab world, and it was because of the rise of Zionism, the emergence of the State of Israel, and the ethnic cleansing of Palestine.
Yeah. Another infamous chain of events that were set off in the immediate, in the preceding years and months before the big, what is referred to as the big Aliyah, where most of Iraq's Jews and then eventually all of Iraq's Jews left, many going to Israel. There were a series of bombs that were planted in and around places frequented by Iraqi Jews, and in one case in a synagogue. And you have done personal investigative research, and you've been able to inconclusively prove that at least 3 of these were carried out or ordered by the Zionist underground. What do these, terrorist attacks mean, and in terms of our understanding of the Jewish exodus from Iraq?
When I was a boy in Israel, there were always rumors among Iraqi Jews that Israel was involved in the bombs that forced them to leave Iraq and make Aliyah to Israel. And I was always fascinated by these rumors, but they were only rumors. There was never any evidence. And when I was working on my autobiography, I found 2 sources of evidence to substantiate the claim of Israeli involvement. One was oral history. I interviewed an elderly Jewish Iraqi friend of my mother's in Ramat Gan, Yaakov Kukli, who was in the Zionist underground, and he told me in detail about what he and his friends got up to in the Zionist underground, including organizing first illegal immigration to Israel through Iran, and then legal immigration, how they paid bribes, how they forged documents in order to shift as many Jews from Iraq to Israel. And he told me that one of his colleagues, Yosef Basri, was responsible for 3 out of the 5 bombs. And that Yosef Basri's controller was an Israeli intelligence officer based in Tehran. This is Iran under the Shah, which had covert relations with Israel. And on orders from the Israeli intelligence officer, whose name was Max Binet, Basri was responsible for 3 out of the 5 bombs. Let me go back for a moment and say that in March 1950, the Iraqi parliament passed a law which said any Jew who wants to leave the country is free to do so. They have a year to register for a one-way visa. And not very many Jews took up the offer of leaving the country. And in the following year, 5 bombs exploded in Jewish sites or a cafe that was frequented by Jews, and including one hand grenade that was lobbed into the Masoud Hashem Tov synagogue. And Basri was caught and tried and convicted. He was only charged with a responsibility for 3 of the bombs, and not the bomb in the synagogue, the famous one. And Kirkukli gave me a page from a Baghdad police report, which named him and quoted what he said in the interrogation. So I have concluded that the Zionist underground, on orders from the Mossad, carried out 3 of the 5 attacks on Jewish premises in Baghdad. And that this was a contributing factor to the big aliyah to Israel. I do not argue that this was the main factor. The main factor was persecution of the Jews after 1948 by the government. But this was a contributing factor that accelerated the exodus of the Jews. And my Zionist critics say to me that I greatly exaggerate the impact of the bombs, that the main reason was endemic Arab anti-Semitism. And my reply to them is that even if I knew for certain that not a single Iraqi Jew left Iraq to go to Israel because of the bombs, I would still utterly condemn the state of Israel for what he did. Because what he did is very serious. What he did was to recruit decent, honest, local Jews and to turn them against their country, to turn them into spies, worse still, to turn them into terrorists, and to get them to carry out terrorist attacks against the Jewish community. And this is a real indictment of the state of Israel, because the raison d'etre of the state of Israel was to provide a haven, a safe haven for the Jews facing persecution everywhere. And in this case, it was Israel that was instigating the persecution of the Jews in an attempt to uproot them from the natural homeland and to bring them to Israel.
Yeah, and that the persecution that you're talking about, that the government, the Iraqi government, unleashed onto the Jews in the aftermath of the creation of the State of Israel. What did that look like? In your book, you write that the one a government was replaced, and the old kind of fox of Iraqi politics, Nouri Said, returned with a kind of personal vendetta against Jewish people and implemented a bunch of laws. And so could you just briefly explain what those laws looked like and why Nouri Said, this who was serving, I think, his ninth mandate period as prime minister in Iraq, and why he all of a sudden had this vendetta against the Jews?
Nouri Said had been very pro-Jewish throughout his long political career. He had served as an officer in the Ottoman army during the First World War. And then he became a minister under Faisal I. Gertrude Bell was a British diplomat based in the embassy in Baghdad. And she was very influential behind the scenes. And she was very pro-Jewish. And she helped Faisal to be elected as king of Iraq after the French had kicked him out of Damascus, where he had established a constitutional monarchy. But the French kicked him out, and the British, Gertrude Bell and Lawrence of Arabia, have helped to procure the throne of Iraq for Faisal as a consolation prize. Gertrude Bell educated Faisal in the importance of the Jewish community, and Faisal embraced the Jewish community in Iraq, and they reciprocated his affection and respect. My mother, as I said before, went to the Alliance Israélite Universelle, and she remembers King Faisal, visiting her school accompanied by the chief rabbi. Now, the same goes for Nouri Said. Gertrude Bell also educated him in the importance of the Jews and the positive values, the positive contribution the Jews could make to Iraqi society. So Nouri Said was pro-Jewish most of his political career, but in 1948 there were protests against the Portsmouth Treaty between Iraq and Britain, and the protests were led by the Communist Party, and there were many Jews in the Communist Party, and that's when he turned against the Jews, because they were not being patriotic, they were not supporting the government or the monarchy. And he even said that he's going to turn the Jews, he's going to make the Jews sell chickpeas in the streets of Baghdad. But then, after Israel was established, Nouri Said was afraid that if all the Jews left Iraq, the Iraqi economy would collapse, because the Jews had a lot of wealth. They were crucial to the Iraqi economy and to the banking system. So he was very worried that Israel would succeed in drawing the Jews of Iraq. This would have serious repercussions for the Iraqi economy, but also all the Jews would go to Palestine, which was now a Jewish state and hostile state to Iraq. That's why he turned against the Jews, and his predecessors had passed the law that I mentioned earlier in March 1950, saying any Jew who wants to leave has a year to register and they can leave. But by a year later, 1949, Nouri Said was back in power, and he passed another law which said any Jew who has surrendered his Iraqi nationality, thereby forfeited his rights as a citizen, including property rights. So the property of the Jews who had registered to leave were all frozen. Their bank accounts were frozen. They couldn't sell their houses. And that was a real blow to the Jewish community in Iraq.
Yeah. You write that tens of thousands of Jews, if not close to 100,000, had registered for this one-way exit visa as a last resort, as a kind of saving grace if things deteriorate. And then they found themselves between a rock and a hard place when this new law comes in saying that if you did register, all your assets are frozen, which spelled catastrophe, not the least for your family. And so reluctantly, your family did eventually decide to leave Iraq and settle in Israel in 1950, and your father stayed behind, but he as well emigrated nearly 2 years later. What was it like arriving at a place where they sprayed Iraqi Jews with DDT, a chemical detergent used for bugs, especially coming from your sort of luxurious upper middle class background?
So once again, we were very privileged. We were wealthy, and also my mother had a British passport because her father had been an interpreter for the British consulate in Baghdad, and two of her brothers were officers in British intelligence. They're not really military people, but they were recruited during the Second World War as interpreters. But they wore British uniform, and they had British nationality, British passports. So in 1950, when the situation became too dangerous, my mother decided to leave. And she, her mother, my two sisters and I left Baghdad on her British passport on a regular flight to Nicosia in Cyprus. And from there we went by boat to Israel. And in Haifa, my mother's uncle came with a lorry, collected us, and drove us to his villa in Ramat Gan. So for us, it was a wrench, painful wrench, but not as traumatic as it was for the vast majority of the Iraqis who made Aliyah. The vast majority had no option but to go to Israel because they left without a passport. They couldn't go anywhere else except to Israel, and Israel provided the transport from Baghdad to Israel. And when they arrived at the Promised Land, they were sprayed with DDT. This was their first experience of being treated in the Promised Land as if they were animals. And the initial period for all of them was extremely difficult because they were sent to transit camps, and they lived in tents or in very temporary accommodation. The sanitary arrangements were very, very primitive. The food was very inadequate, and also it was Ashkenazi food, not the food that they were used to. And worst of all, on top of all the hardship, physical and material hardships, the managers of the Ma'abarot, of the transit camps, were all Labour Party apparatchiks. They were Ashkenazi Jews who knew nothing about the status, the achievements, the history, the prominence of these Jews. And they looked down on them, and they thought that instead of complaining, they should be grateful for everything that Israel was doing for them. So here is where I challenge the Zionist master narrative, which says the Jews' first persecution throughout the Arab world, the newly born state of Israel offered them a safe haven, made great sacrifice in absorbing them. So that's the dominant Zionist narrative, whereas I think that the Jews would have preferred to stay where they were, and the state of Israel, not out of any noble commitment or care for the Jews of the Arab lands, but out of reasons of state, helped to uproot them and to bring them to Israel because they were needed in Israel. After the 48 war, the Jews were only about 600,000. They were a minority in the middle of the Arab world, and Aliyah became a top priority. So the Zionist movement, which had never really respected the Jews of the Arab lands, that looked down on them after the Holocaust, changed its attitude, and after the birth of Israel, it became a Zionist imperative to bring as many Jews as possible to Israel.
Avi Shlaim, I've taken up quite a bit of your time, and I really appreciate that. But I'd like to end with asking you maybe kind of a strange question. But I had an idea. I told you before this interview that I'm going to have a great opportunity to travel to Baghdad later this year, and I had the idea of approaching the Iraqi government and posing a simple question to them: why don't you, as a sort of gesture of goodwill, welcome back the Jews, the Iraqi Jews? Not that maybe many would want to go back. What do you think that they would answer? And do you think that this is a reasonable question to ask?
It most definitely is a reasonable question to ask, and the context in Iraq would support posing this question today, because there's been a rethinking among Iraqi intellectuals about this whole subject, and there's been writing in the press by these intellectuals, and they look back on their history and they see that the Jews were a very positive element in their society. The Jews had contributed so much, and it was a tragedy that the Jews left, and they blame their government, at least partly their government, for persecuting the Jews and driving them out. And now they regret it, they apologize, they want to make amends, and they would like the Jews to return. So it'd be a completely fair question to pose. And I don't know what answer you would get, but what I find interesting is that there is internet, social media connection between these liberal Iraqis and Iraqi Jews, and they have networks for communicating all the time. And this is the message that the Iraqis send. We are so sorry, we apologize, we really value what you did for Iraq in the past, and we will welcome you back to Iraq. And I had the privilege of living in an Arab country before going to Israel. So for me, Arabs, Iraqis are not just the enemy, they are human beings. I relate to them as human beings. And the state of the Middle East today is completely dismal. It's never been, a state with sectarianism, with Israel as a more polarizing force than ever before, and now conducting genocide in Gaza. So I hark back to my own background as an Arab Jew, and my own experience as an Arab Jew enables me to think of a better future for our region.
Avi Shlaim, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us today at Kalam Podcast.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.